All right, welcome everyone to the first of two webinars on how to finally have the nutrition results you deserve. It's Dr. Nick here, leader nutrition, performance coach, and founder of the NutriFit program. I've put this webinar together because my major purpose in life is to help others master their nutrition so they can have outstanding results in energy, health, and body composition that they've always wanted. Today I'm going to show you the reality of our current health and food environment and our three biggest food problems we face daily. But before we go there, who am I? Well, I'm a nutrition leader, as I mentioned, and I've studied for 12 years and have 4 degrees, with the highest being a PhD in post-exercise fat metabolism. I founded the nutrition consultancy company NutriFit in 2006 over in Melbourne, and I've spoken on the international stage for my research and seminars, and I published some incredible scientific journals. I'm a competitive cyclist with a couple of handy results there on the mountain bike, and I've have over 2 decades of lecturing experience in the field of nutrition, exercise physiology, and fitness. So we've got the science covered and you're in good hands. Here's the first question to consider. Now, which life are you designing? And if you look at these two individuals, they're about the same age chronologically, but clearly very, very different biologically. That is, their lifestyle choices have led them down 2 very different paths. And so I want to share with you today some concepts that can help you adopt lifestyle practices, particularly with physical activity nutrition, that can lead you to having the highest quality of life and living life to the full, really, so you can take advantage of the short journey we have in this lifetime. So some other questions to consider here. Do you feel like nutrition's a minefield? Are you really confused, like you just don't know which way to turn? You know, I actually get confused myself as a scientist. I look at the scientific literature, there's conflicting evidence, and it's really challenging to carve out a pathway through all that information. Are you also feeling like your nutrition wheels have been spinning and you're not gaining any traction? And if so, you're not alone, because so many are also feeling the same way. And I get a lot of clients coming to me feeling like there's got to be an easier and more effective way of eating food, that surely it can't be this hard. And indeed it doesn't have to be. And I want to show you in these 2 webinars some information to help you make simple, easy choices so you can really improve the quality of your life and have the results that you deserve. So how healthy are we as New Zealanders? Well, we're doing some good things. Over the last decade, our rates of smoking has declined. And our rates of diagnosed ischemic heart disease and stroke has also decreased. So that's a positive outcome. However, there are a range of things that aren't so great. Firstly, our fruit and vegetable intake has declined. In fact, since 2006, we're not even able to, we're eating less of our 3 serves of vegetables and 2 serves of fruit. We're simply falling way short of those basic requirements. We're less active, and that leads to an increase in obesity. In fact, over the last 10 years, our obesity rates have climbed from 19% to 32% of the adult population. This has led to health conditions like higher rates of high blood pressure and high cholesterol, and to top it off, we have higher rates of arthritis and chronic pain. So overall, we're not a healthy nation. Now, what's even more alarming is our rates of excess body fat in our young children, age 5 to 9, and also in our younger teens, age 10 to 14. And as a consequence of developing excess body fat early on in life, we're more likely to become overweight adults. And we can see this right through the age span, indeed even in the 75 plus age group. So this is of concern. And one of the consequences here is increased rates of what's called degenerative disease. And so the irony is that, despite the fact that we're living longer through advancements in medical science, we're actually dying earlier. Our quality of life in our latter years is really, really reduced. And that's because we're suffering from the major ailments like heart disease and cancer and stroke and respiratory disease and diabetes. And I imagine those watching this webinar today probably know of at least one person that has had or currently has one of these conditions. And that's not a great statistic. So the good news is this: we can do something about it. And nutrition is strongly linked to the incidence of these diseases. So if we start to adopt positive nutrition and lifestyle practices, we can reverse and certainly prevent these problems. Now, the dilemma is this in our nutrition world today, that we understand more about what's in food and what food does to our bodies than ever before. However, healthy eating has declined, we've never been so confused, and we're overloaded with kilojoules and energy from food that's just devoid of any nutrients. It's high in fat, high in sugar, and yet we're suffering from a lack of nutrients and malnutrition. And here's a statement from Professor Boyd Swinburne, a weight management expert, who says obesity is a normal response to an abnormal environment, which is a very powerful way of saying that we really are in an obesogenic environment, that the world we live in is set up to develop excess body fat today. So how do we navigate that minefield out there? Well, we need to firstly be aware of the problems. And here's the biggest one. We're told that a calorie is a calorie. So most of us are led to believe that we simply need to balance input and output and life is good. We're all good. We shouldn't be gaining body weight. But the issue is that despite the fact that many are striving to lower their intake, they still gain weight. But the equation just simply doesn't work. So there's something else that must be at play. And indeed, a calorie is not a calorie. So we're going to really bust that myth. And here's the reality now is that our body controls our energy output that's dependent on the quantity and quality of the energy ingested. So the type of food matters. In fact, simply put, a calorie eaten is not a calorie eaten. So let's explain this a little further. Let's look at fullness as one example. So if we look at a high protein food like nice lean salmon, eggs or nuts and seeds, and if we ingest those foods, we get a high degree of satiety or fullness. And for example, you may have an omelette in the morning or scrambled eggs, and that feels quite filling. Contrast that to carbohydrate foods. And if you look at something like bread or some oats, rolled oats, whole grain oats are a great option, by the way, for breakfast in the morning. However, if we looked at the same energy from oats versus something like an omelette, we would still feel more satiated and full with that higher protein food, and definitely more so than a higher fatty food. Like if you start, I know this sounds crazy, but let's say you had, some ice cream for breakfast, but it was the same energy intake as your carbohydrate and protein, you would feel much less satiated. But of course you're wondering, well, why is it that I feel really just, over full from fatty food? That's because you've had a lot of energy. So fried food leaves you feeling, your stomach feeling just very weighted down, and that's because there's a lot of energy that's sitting there that has to be slowly dispersed through your intestinal tract. So the next problem here is that we've all been told to eat low fat. And here's the interesting thing, that these low-fat guidelines came in at about the exact time that our obesity epidemic started. And you can see that trend there across all age spans in the US. And this has just spread. Of course, in New Zealand here, we're told the same thing, keep your fat intake low. Now, there is some merit to that. But if we start to dramatically lower fat, there's something else that happens to our food, which we'll look at coming up. But where did this come from? Well, it started with a gentleman, an American physiologist called Ancel Keys. He was most well known for developing K rations in World War II. And he published the 7-country study. And on face value here, it looks like it's pretty compelling evidence that when you increase your calories from fat on that horizontal or that x-axis, that increases the rates of death from heart disease on the vertical or y-axis. And you can see that Australia there is up on the higher end of the scale, Japan down low, and it looks like a fairly straightforward story. Lower fat and we reduce heart disease, but that's not the full picture. Science is not all created equal. Here's the real story. The real story is there are 22 countries that wasn't made known to the general public. And so the relationship just completely falls apart. There are some countries like France and Sweden there that's where there's high rates of fat intake, but yet heart disease is low. So what's the other factor that Ancel Keys did not consider? Well, at the time he was battling with a gentleman called Professor John Yudkin, a really reputable scientist in the UK, a British nutritionist and physiologist, and he published a book called Pure, White and Deadly. And what he's referring to was really the real culprit of our global obesity metabolic syndrome pandemic, the real omnivore's curse. And it is excess sugar. It's this white stuff that, in fact, has some real detrimental properties on our metabolism and particularly on things like our liver. Let's have a look at that. In fact, a little bit of chemistry here. And sugar, interestingly, is both a carbohydrate and fat. Now, it's made up of two molecules, glucose and fructose, and that gives a two-unit molecule called sucrose. But it's the fructose that really is the problem aspect here. It's what gives it the sugar its sweetness, and it's what makes fruit so sweet. So we like this, but it's metabolized like fat in the liver. And in fact, what happens is that when you flood your liver with fructose, as you might do from fruit juice, you get an increase in fat storage. You develop insulin resistance, which leads to diabetes, which you've probably heard of, and that's a major ailment. We mentioned that before. Now, at the same time, we also develop what's called leptin resistance, which creates a false sense of starvation. Leptin is a peptide hormone. It gets secreted from your fat cells, and its key role is to regulate energy intake and also increase fat burning. So if that doesn't work, we want to keep consuming more food, and particularly more sugar, and that leads to developing obesity, greater fat storage, because sugar is readily converted to body fat in the liver and also in your fat cells under your skin. And so this is a vicious cycle. And so if any of you are intrigued by this little bit of biochemistry, I highly recommend the book Fat Chance by Dr. Robert Lustig. When I read this book, my eyes were just opened widely to the damaging effects of sugar, processed food, and particularly fructose. So in New Zealand, how are we doing in terms of our sugar consumption? Well, you might imagine it's actually not great. In fact, compared to the guidelines for adults, about 30 grams or 7 teaspoons, and for younger individuals, for children, 7 to 10, 24 grams, 7 to 6 teaspoons, and for really young children, about 5 teaspoons. Well, as a population on average, males in New Zealand consume 120 grams of sugars a day. Yep, that's 4 times the daily amount. And females about 3 times as much. And for the average intake for boys is about 17 teaspoons, and for girls 15. Wow. This is just staggering. And for men, 120 grams a day, just to give you an idea, is 43 kilograms of sugar per year. That's a staggering amount. Now, where is this coming from? Well, it's mainly fluids. So we have to really be aware of the sugary beverages we consume. In fact, as we'll look at in part 2, we really want to be eating energy, not drinking it. And one of the most problem areas is fruit juice, to be fair. Fruit juice is highly damaging because of that high fructose content, and it really just floods that liver, and you get an increase in fat storage very quickly, and this leads to metabolic disturbance. Red Bull is just a craziness cocktail. You've got your sugar plus your caffeine, and that's really not ideal at all. Chocolate milk can be used post-exercise, but if you're not working out, then again, it's going to really rapidly increase sugar intake. And then things like muffins and muesli bars and cereal, my goodness, Nutri-Grain. How on earth did that get 4-star rating? I have no idea. So just be mindful of, when you're looking at these products, being savvy about food labels is a real key aspect there. So why are we consuming so much sugar? Well, here's what we're not told about either. It's addictive. And let's have a look at the criteria. You only need 3 out of 7 criteria to classify as being addictive, but sugar actually meets all 7. You need more sugar to give you that rewards, that's tolerance. And if you take it away, you get headaches, as many experience, that's withdrawal. We binge on sugary foods, we attempt to cut down, we definitely have sugar cravings. It interferes with life because we can't go without it. We have to, go and do what we can to grab it, and then we still use highly processed food, sugary-laden food, despite the fact that our health is suffering and we're gaining weight. So here's one of the key messages, that you just simply can't beat your body's biochemistry. It's too powerful. There's no way you're going to win that battle. And so one of the ways that we can start to work with our biochemistry is to reduce refined sugar. Now, the final problem here is that we are of the understanding that food provides for all of our nutrient needs. We're under the impression that as long as we eat, healthy food, then we're going to get all those nutrients we need. As we've seen, that the majority of New Zealanders don't even meet the basic 3 veggies, serves of veggies and 2 pieces of fruit. But even if they are, the mineral content, if you look at what's happened in the last century, it's a dramatic decline in the Europe and Americas, and also in New Zealand. And we know we're low in selenium, for example, and many other minerals also. So as a consequence, we're not getting the nutrients we need to win the battle against poor health and other things like free radicals we'll talk about coming up. So look at this. Is healthy food enough? It's an interesting question. Well, what do we need to really give our body optimal levels? That is, for our cells to have everything they need. And these are the amounts here for a selected range of micronutrients, these small nutrients. And we see that the amounts are just out of reach for most. 9 kiwi fruit possibly, but over a kilogram of salmon. I love salmon, but geez, that's pretty crazy. 16 eggs for vitamin D, 3.6 kilograms of red meat for a B12, my goodness. 20 bottles of yogurt for calcium. It's just excessive. I love eating food, but and by the way, this is daily. That this is needed. Now, if we also look at the fact that we're burdened by free radicals from a range of areas, pollution, we're stressed today in our modern world, we're more hectic and overloaded than ever. We have radiation from phones and from microwaves, and we're toxins, certainly from cigarette smoke and just a whole range of other things in the environment. So we're burdened now by what can be called oxidative stress. And this, together with highly processed food, with additives and lots of sugar and fat and low levels of nutrients, coupled with this oxidative stress, leads to disease. And this disease is caused by inflammation. And a good example is what happens when an apple goes brown. That browning is that oxidative stress in action. And that's what happens inside our body. And over time, that leads to the health elements we mentioned before. So what can we do about this? Well, we need to start giving our bodies an increase in defense against these free radicals, and this is where antioxidants come in. You might have heard of this term, and these are essential for our cellular health. They protect our body against the damaging effects that we encounter daily. But actually, we're not going to dive into this today. We're going to leave this right now, and we're going to look at the solutions to having the health and the results that you deserve next time. Hopefully, ideally, you're more aware of our challenging food environment now, and I really thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar today. And make sure you look at part 2, which will be covering on our food problem solutions. So until then, eat well and take action every day to master your nutrition.